Imagine this. An 85-year-old political heavyweight steps into a roaring stadium, sunlight bouncing off blue flags, and the sound of drums shaking the ground like a football final. No, this isn't a sports victory. It's democracy, on full display in Malawi. Peter Mutharika, once written off as a retired professor turned political relic, has just rewritten the script. And it's one heck of a plot twist. After years of political turbulence, scandals, and leadership fatigue, Malawi witnessed what could easily be called the sequel nobody saw coming. On this historic day at Kamuzu Stadium, the DPP faithful painted Blantyre in blue, a sea of color, noise, and nostalgia. The moment felt more like a rebirth than a routine oath. Cameras flashed, choirs sang, and Mutharika stood front and center, promising not miracles, but hard work, discipline, and tough love. And if you thought inaugurations were just ceremonial yawns, you clearly haven't seen Malawi do it. Because this one, it had everything. Emotion, irony, and a comeback story worthy of Netflix. So today we're breaking down 8 electrifying facts behind Peter Mutharika's 2025 inauguration, the meaning behind the spectacle, and why this single event might just shape Africa's next big leadership chapter. Let's begin, because Malawi's political theater just dropped a new act. The first thing that blows your mind about this story? Peter Mutharika actually did it again. The 85-year-old former president didn't just return to politics, he steamrolled his way back into power like a man possessed by unfinished business. In the September 2025 general election, he clinched over 56% of the national vote, soundly defeating incumbent Lazarus Chakwera, who lagged behind at roughly 33%. For context, that's not just a win, it's a political resurrection. Mutharika's victory speech before the swearing-in already hinted at his agenda: stability, anti-corruption, and what he calls economic honesty. But let's not sugarcoat it. This comeback wasn't born out of pure nostalgia. It was frustration-fueled. Many Malawians were weary of broken promises and rising prices. Power cuts, fuel shortages, and grain inflation had turned daily life into survival mode. The people didn't necessarily want to relive the past. They wanted a leader who remembered how the system worked and wasn't afraid to call out its rot. So how does a man at 85 convince a nation he's the future, not the past? By reminding them that wisdom sometimes outlasts youth, and that a familiar captain, even an old one, is better than another storm. Supporters cheered not because he was new, but because he was known. They called it the return of the professor. Critics, however, called it the longest political flashback in Africa. Either way, he won. Transition hook. But a comeback story is only as strong as its stage, and Peter Mutharika's chosen battleground wasn't just symbolic, it was sacred ground in Malawi's political memory. So let's move to the stadium where history literally echoed through the stands. If power had a sound, it would be the thunder rolling inside Kamuzu Stadium on Inauguration Day. Located in the heart of Blantyre, the iconic venue was transformed into a stage of history, where thousands gathered under the blazing October sun to witness not just an oath, but a rebirth. The stadium has its own mythology. Once renamed Chichiri Stadium, it reclaimed its original title Kamuzu, in honor of Malawi's founding father, Dr. Hastings Kamuzu Banda, a man whose legacy still defines the country's political DNA. And now, under the banner of the DPP, that name carried new weight. The choice of Kamuzu Stadium wasn't just convenience, it was message. It was Mutharika saying, "We are restoring order where chaos once ruled." Crowds packed every seat, waving flags in DPP blue and white, colors that shimmered like an ocean under sunlight. The mood? Electric. Bands played victory anthems, soldiers paraded with precision, and even the skies seemed to cooperate. Commentators joked that the only thing louder than the crowd was the irony. The same leader once criticized for being out of touch was now being cheered like a returning hero. High-profile dignitaries, justices, and military officials lined the VIP section. Each segment of the ceremony was choreographed to perfection, from the entrance of the Chief Justice to the rhythmic applause that punctuated each speech. At one point, the crowd erupted when the announcer declared, "Malawi now witnesses the arrival of the president-elect." You could feel the weight of national pride and maybe a hint of disbelief. The significance of Kamuzu Stadium went beyond spectacle. It symbolized unity, or at least the aspiration of it. This wasn't just where Mutharika was sworn in, it was where Malawi tried to reset its narrative. From division to direction, from fatigue to faith. Whether that hope lasts beyond the ceremony, That's another story. Transition hook. Because as the drums faded and the anthem rose, all eyes turned to one man, one Bible, and one promise. The words that followed weren't just political, they were personal. Up next is the oath and the promise that could define Mutharika's legacy.
Launching visual cue. Close-up on Mutharika's hand raised over the Constitution, stadium echoing with applause. The moment came. The music faded, the crowd fell to a hush, and the air turned electric. Peter Mutharika, flanked by his wife, his vice president-elect, and an entire entourage of justices in flowing robes, stepped forward to take the presidential oath. It was one of those cinematic moments that transcend politics, half solemn, half theatrical, but fully charged with symbolism. For a man returning to power at 85, this wasn't just about continuity, it was about redemption. Mutharika took the Constitution in his right hand, spoke the words slowly, and sealed them with deliberate gravity. His voice, though older, carried authority, the kind that comes from knowing both defeat and power. The crowd erupted as the Chief Justice declared him President of the Republic of Malawi. And then came the speech, the part everyone waited for. His words cut through the noise with a blend of realism and fire. "I do not promise milk and honey," he said, "but I promise you hard work, tough, and painful decisions." The crowd roared. It wasn't the sweet talk of campaign days. It was the kind of brutal honesty that made people sit up straighter. Mutharika called out corruption directly, saying the era of government looting was over. He acknowledged the debt crisis and the shrinking foreign aid pipeline. He didn't dodge the country's economic wounds, he named them one by one in front of millions watching live. That alone was a power move. Because in a world of polished slogans and vague pledges, a dose of blunt truth feels revolutionary. He spoke about rebuilding Malawi's credibility abroad, reviving investor confidence, and ending dependency on donor aid. He framed his new term not as a fresh start, but as a moral reset. And as the speech rolled on, it felt less like a political address and more like a confession, a recognition of how far the country had slipped and how tough the climb ahead would be. For supporters, it was a rallying cry. For skeptics, a wait-and-see moment. But one thing was undeniable. Mutharika had taken center stage again, and he was writing his own second act. But talk is easy when the spotlight's hot. Once the confetti settles, reality checks come knocking, hard. And for Malawi, those knocks sound a lot like crisis, debt, and drought. Let's turn to the harsh truths waiting for the new president outside that stadium. Visual cue. Slow-motion footage of fuel lines, parched fields, and markets with rising prices. If Inauguration Day was a festival of hope, the next morning was a crash course in reality. Malawi's problems don't pause for applause. They were right there waiting at the palace gate. Let's start with the basics. The economy is struggling. Inflation has clawed deep into household budgets. The price of maize, the country's staple food, has risen to painful levels, and the kwacha has been slipping faster than confidence in most political speeches. Mutharika's government inherits a near-empty treasury and a mountain of public debt accumulated through years of questionable borrowing. The foreign reserves are thin, aid is drying up, and the nation's financial future feels like a tightrope walk over a bonfire. And then there's energy, or the lack of it. Malawi's power grid has become a metaphor for its politics, unpredictable, flickering, and occasionally plunging into darkness. Fuel shortages have stretched supply lines to their limits, affecting hospitals, schools, and small businesses. People queue for hours hoping for a few liters of petrol while the government scrambles to stabilize imports. On the environmental front, the situation is just as grim. Climate shocks, from droughts to floods, have become the unwanted seasonal guest. Entire harvests have been wiped out by erratic weather, leaving farmers desperate and food security hanging by a thread. When Mutharika said the country faces painful decisions, he wasn't exaggerating. Malawi is in the middle of a multi-dimensional crisis that touches every sector, every family, every dream. Internationally, too, the road is steep. Relations with donor nations have cooled over past governance issues and transparency concerns. The United States cut back aid in recent years, and European partners are watching cautiously. Mutharika will need to rebuild credibility not just with voters, but with creditors and investors who hold the keys to economic revival. It's a tall order, and while he carries decades of experience, critics argue that the challenges of 2025 are far more complex than those of his earlier presidency. The world has changed. Malawi's population is younger, angrier, and more digitally connected, and they expect more than speeches. They want action, jobs, electricity, and affordable food. So yes, the oath was inspiring, the promises were bold, but the clock is already ticking, and the people are watching closely because in this new Malawi, applause doesn't last long when the lights go out. Now that we've seen the mountain he has to climb, the next big question is, how does he plan to do it? Coming up, Mutharika's grand roadmap for reform, and why some say it's more wish list than blueprint.
Every leader walks into office waving a plan, but few walk in waving the same plan twice. Peter Mutharika calls his new term a fresh mission, but let's be honest, it's a remix of unfinished business. The man's political playlist hasn't changed much. Development, discipline, and that age-old hit single called Zero Tolerance for Corruption. The difference this time, the country's patience is on a countdown timer. Mutharika's inaugural blueprint sounded like a moral crusade wrapped in an economic plan. He promised to chase away corruption with the last ounce of his strength, to lure back foreign investors, and to revive Malawi's credibility on the global stage. Sounds noble, but dig beneath the applause and you'll notice the fine print is thinner than Malawi's fuel reserves. He pledged to reform public finance, starting with what he called accounting honesty. Translation, no more ghost projects, no more vanishing budgets. Then came the headline grabber, a vow to recover every stolen kwacha. The crowd went wild. Journalists scribbled furiously. Skeptics quietly rolled their eyes. Because let's face it, corruption crackdowns in African politics often end up like New Year's resolutions. Loud in January, forgotten by March. Still, there was fresh fire in his delivery. He even looked into the camera, eyes steady, and said, "This is my last warning to those who steal from Malawi." It was classic Mutharika. Stern professor meets courtroom prosecutor. And for a brief moment, you could almost believe that this time, maybe the cleanup will stick. Beyond corruption, his plan leans heavily on investment over aid. He wants to shake off Malawi's image as a perpetual charity case and build a self-sustaining economy. There's talk of forming new bilateral trade corridors with the Gulf and China, a push for agricultural modernization, and even an investor summit in Lilongwe later this year. Lofty goals, all of them, but analysts point out one missing detail: the money. Where will the capital come from when the treasury's echoing like an empty oil drum? Then there's his team. The most talked about appointment is his vice president, Jane Anza, a former head of the Electoral Commission and a figure both respected and controversial. Her selection signaled continuity with a dash of risk. To supporters, it meant competence. To critics, it looked like the recycling of political elites. And the clock is already ticking on expectations. He's promised economic revival in 18 months. Infrastructure revamps within 2 years, and national unity from day one. But so far, no budget, no timeline, and no clear explanation of how he plans to pay for any of it. That's why many are calling this roadmap
a wish list, ambitious, poetic, but light on logistics. Yet even wish lists matter in politics. They create hope, and hope is still Malawi's most valuable currency. Transition hook. But here's the twist. For every leader drawing blueprints, there are always shadows off stage. And on this bright October day, it wasn't just what we saw that made headlines. It was who we didn't. Politics loves symbolism. And on this bright October day, symbolism sat, or rather didn't sit, front and center. Missing from the glittering guest list was outgoing President Lazarus Chakwera. The man Mutharika defeated chose to not attend the ceremony. Officially, his party cited schedule conflicts. Unofficially, the silence roared louder than any marching band. His absence sent ripples across the stands. People whispered, cameras panned toward the empty chair, and commentators filled the gap with speculation. Some called it diplomatic frost. Others labeled it quiet protest. Whatever the reason, it cast a faint shadow over an otherwise flawless ceremony, because in African politics, absences can sometimes say more than speeches. Still, credit where due. Chakwera's Malawi Congress Party, MCP, did issue a formal statement of congratulations, pledging to respect the democratic outcome. It was civil, polished, and short, the political equivalent of a polite smile across the room. Yet insiders say party strategists are already regrouping for a legislative pushback. The battle may have moved from the ballot box to parliament, but make no mistake, it's far from over. The event's protocol officers cleverly filled the narrative gap by spotlighting the international guests, ambassadors from neighboring Zambia, Tanzania, and Mozambique, who cheered from the stands. But everyone knew the empty seat had already stolen the show. To ordinary Malawians, though, the absence didn't ruin the moment. For them, the day was about closure. A long election cycle was finally over. The chants in the stadium drowned out the tension outside of it. People wanted a breather from conflict, a glimmer of stability, even if temporary. Yet beneath the celebration, a quiet question lingered. Can Mutharika truly unite the country if his biggest rival won't share the same stage? The optics mattered. In a democracy still healing from past divisions, unity isn't just policy, it's performance. And for now, that performance has an empty spotlight waiting to be filled. Transition hook. So with the fanfare fading and the VIP seats emptying, the bigger picture begins to emerge. This isn't just a local story. It's a signal to the entire continent. Coming up next, how Malawi's 2025 inauguration is rewriting Africa's political script and what the world is watching for. By now, Kamuzu Stadium's confetti has settled, the brass band's last note has dissolved into the Blantyre breeze, and the headlines are looping across every African network. But this isn't just another national ceremony. This is a geopolitical pulse check. When Peter Mutharika raised his hand, it wasn't just Malawi that shifted. The continent felt a tremor. Across Africa, the narrative of leadership renewal is playing out in real time. Aging leaders, reform-minded youths, coups, comebacks. It's a continental carousel spinning faster than ever. And then there's Malawi, calmly saying, "We'll go with experience. Thank you very much." Peter Mutharika's inauguration reopens an old debate. Can a leader from yesterday solve tomorrow's crises? For some, his return represents continuity and wisdom. For others, it's a step backward, dressed in nostalgia. Yet the world can't look away because this isn't an isolated episode. It's a microcosm of Africa's democratic identity crisis. Analysts from Nairobi to Abuja have weighed in. One Kenyan columnist wrote, "Mutharika's comeback is a masterclass in political patience." South African commentators called it a referendum on memory over novelty. And international investors? They're watching with calculators in one hand and popcorn in the other. Because stability, even recycled stability, can look mighty appealing in a region still reeling from coups and currency collapses. There's also the diplomacy angle. Mutharika's message that Malawi will seek partnerships, not pity, could mark a shift in how smaller economies negotiate aid.
Expect new trade flirtations with China, the Gulf, and even regional blocs like SADC. If he delivers on transparency, the West might return with open checkbooks. If not, expect a cautious distance. But perhaps the most fascinating subplot is generational. 60% of Malawians are under 25, digital natives who scroll faster than politicians can draft speeches. To them, the swearing in wasn't just political theater, it was a test. Can an octogenarian president keep up with a smartphone-powered nation? If Mutharika manages to bridge that gap, he won't just make history, he'll rewrite it. In short, this inauguration wasn't a local parade. It was a continental statement that democracy in Africa is messy, unpredictable, sometimes ironic, but still alive and loud. Transition hook. And speaking of unpredictability, let's roll the dice forward because every inauguration plants the seeds of 100 predictions. Ready for a look into the crystal ball? Let's go. Prediction number 1. Selective shock therapy. Expect early fireworks in the anti-corruption drive. A few big-name arrests will make the evening news. Dramatic, satisfying, and politically convenient. It's the oldest trick in the reform playbook. Start at the top to prove a point, then quietly slow down once the headlines fade. Whether that momentum lasts past the first budget cycle, that's the real test. Prediction number 2. Foreign policy shuffle. With Washington tightening its aid purse, Mutharika will likely pivot east and south, courting China for infrastructure loans, the Gulf for energy investment, and South Africa for trade ties. Expect the buzzword self-reliance in every press release. But self-reliance without revenue is just rhetoric with good posture. Prediction number 3. Public patience on a timer. Malawians are hopeful, but hungry. If fuel queues and maize prices don't ease within a year, goodwill will evaporate faster than diesel in a heat wave. Social media activism will spike, and the opposition will pounce. In modern Malawi, viral frustration travels faster than official reassurance. Still, there's room for optimism. Mutharika knows this isn't just about politics. It's about legacy. He's not fighting for another term. He's fighting for the footnote history will attach to his name. That awareness might just push him to surprise everyone, including himself. So, buckle up. The honeymoon will be brief, the scrutiny relentless, and the expectations sky high. But for now, Malawi stands on a hopeful edge, equal parts risk and rebirth. Transition hug. And that brings us full circle, from oath to outcome, from fireworks to footnotes. But before we close, let's bring it home with the pulse that drives this channel, what this moment means for the rest of us. The final word. Here's the takeaway. In an age where political fatigue is global, Malawi just proved that democracy still knows how to surprise. Peter Mutharika swearing in wasn't just ceremony. It was a gamble between past experience and future promise. It asked a simple question that echoes far beyond Blantyre. Can a leader from yesterday still fix the problems of tomorrow? Maybe he can, maybe he won't. But the courage to try again at 85 in front of a skeptical nation, that alone earns a standing ovation. Because whether you love Mutharika or doubt him, you can't deny this. Malawi just pulled off one of the most cinematic political revivals of the decade. So, if you found yourself hooked by this blend of power, irony, and resilience, don't just scroll away. Hit like, tap subscribe, and ring that bell, because at Global Pulse News, we dig into the stories behind the ceremonies, the politics behind the promises, and the truth hiding between the applause lines. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Mutharika's comeback will steer Malawi toward reform or replay the same old tune? Your take might just make it into our next episode. Until then, stay sharp, stay curious, and remember, in global politics, yesterday's president might just be tomorrow's plot twist.